Why did the room go quiet when the Marines started laughing? The dining hall was loud enough to swallow most mistakes. Forks scraped plastic trays, boots scuffed linoleum. Conversations collided and disappeared into the constant hum of fluorescent lights. 500 people ate, joked, argued, lived. And in the far corner, a woman sat alone. She wasn't trying to be invisible. That was the thing, she simply was. Her movements were small, efficient. A fork lifted, a measured chew, a pause that felt deliberate, not hesitant. No rank on her uniform, no name tape, just a plain set of utilities and a patch most people didn't recognize. Gray hair pulled back without apology, hands worn smooth in places where gloves had rubbed for decades. Staff Sergeant Derek Morrison noticed her because she didn't notice him. That alone felt like a challenge. He was loud by habit, confident by repetition. The kind of man who believed space belonged to him the moment he entered it. When he spoke, people usually responded. When they didn't, he corrected that. He didn't know her name, didn't ask, didn't care. "Hey," he said, stopping in front of her table. "I'm talking to you." She took another bite. Something sharp twisted in his chest. Not fear, never fear. Irritation. Disrespect always felt personal to him. He leaned closer, crowding her space, letting his shadow fall across her tray. "Don't you know where you are?" he said. "This isn't a place for civilians." She didn't rush. She didn't flinch. She finished chewing before she set her fork down, aligning it carefully beside the knife. Only then did she look up. Her eyes were gray, pale, unreadable, not cold, empty, as if whatever reaction he was hunting simply wasn't there to be found. "That's not how this works," she said quietly. The words landed wrong, not defiant, not submissive, final. He laughed because laughing felt safer than acknowledging the strange tightening in his gut. His team laughed with him. Someone raised a phone, red light blinking. He told himself he was in control. He was. She knew his name before he told her. His deployments, his weaknesses, the things he pretended were strengths. Each detail stripped another layer of certainty from him, and when she stood slowly, calmly, the room felt different, smaller, as if gravity had shifted. "We'll end you," he said, because backing down had never been an option he recognized. "We'll make sure you're done." She didn't argue, didn't threaten back. She simply watched him with that same empty gaze and asked one question. "Are you finished?" Then she walked away. And only after she was gone did the silence fall. What kind of woman walks away from a threat like that without looking back? 72 hours earlier, the desert had been quieter, honest in a way buildings never were. Commander Margaret Callahan preferred it that way. The rifle felt familiar in her hands, not comforting, familiar, like an old scar you stop noticing until someone touches it. The scope was scratched, outdated, technically replaceable, but she never would. Some things carried weight beyond function. She didn't use it. She read the wind instead, watched dust rise and fall, felt the temperature on her cheek. The rifle was an extension of her breath, her pulse, her memory. "For you," she whispered. The steel rang a second later. 5 shots, 5 hits, tight enough to hide beneath a playing card. She didn't smile. Pride wasn't loud with her. Pride was private, brief. She'd been good for a long time, too long to be surprised by it anymore. When Master Gunnery Sergeant Reeves spoke behind her, she didn't turn. She already knew who it was. She always did. "You still showing off?" he asked. "I'm practicing," she said. "There's a difference." He brought news with him, an exercise, a big one, observers, pressure, and a photograph she hadn't seen in 13 years. Her husband's face stared back at her from another life. Grief didn't come like it used to. It didn't crash. It settled, heavy, constant. She carried it the way she carried everything else, with discipline. "He'd be proud," Reeves said. She wasn't sure that mattered anymore. Survival had required her to stop thinking in those terms. But later that night, alone, she thought about it anyway. Why do the most dangerous people so often go unnoticed? Private Elena Vasquez shook when she fired, not from fear, from effort, from trying too hard, from wanting something badly enough that it tightened every muscle. "You're holding your breath," Callahan said, stepping into the darkness beside her. The young Marine startled, embarrassed, apologetic, used to being corrected loudly, not quietly. "Don't," Callahan said, adjusting her grip. "Breathe." The next shot rang true. Something in Vasquez's face changed. Hope, maybe, or belief. Callahan recognized it. She'd seen it flicker in mirrors decades ago. "People overlook you," Callahan said. "That's not a flaw, it's an advantage." Vasquez didn't fully understand yet, but she would. Callahan walked away knowing something she hadn't admitted to herself until then. She still wanted to teach. Not because she needed validation, because some things were meant to be passed on. What happens when confidence finally runs out? The exercise broke Morrison. Technology failed first, then certainty, then leadership. Blind, isolated, hunted, he froze, not physically, internally, the worst kind. When the radio crackled to life with her voice, calm and controlled, it felt like shame burning through him. She guided him anyway, protected him anyway, saved him anyway. He followed her instructions because there was nothing left to cling to but survival. And when the red force fell one by one, never seen, never heard, understood something terrifying. He had never been the apex predator in the room. He had just been loud. Why does true power rarely announce itself? Callahan hunted methodically, not with anger, not with vengeance, with precision. Each shot was a decision, each movement calculated. Age slowed her body but sharpened her judgment. She didn't chase targets, she anticipated them. When she found Victor Keene, she didn't gloat, didn't posture. "You forgot something," she told him. "What?" "That I'm better." The antenna fell, the war ended. Victory didn't feel like triumph. It felt like exhaustion, like a long-held breath finally released. What does dignity sound like when it speaks? The footage played in silence. The truth didn't raise its voice. It didn't need to. Morrison stood smaller than he ever had, stripped of narrative, stripped of excuses. His apology wasn't eloquent. It was honest. And honesty, she knew, was harder than bravado. "I accept," she said. Not for him, for herself. Later, alone on the range, she fired again. One shot, one hit, the rhythm steady, familiar. Reeves stood beside her. "He'd be proud," he said again. This time she believed it. Because strength hadn't been proven by domination, or noise, or cruelty. It had been proven by restraint. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. Why did the desert always feel quieter when she was thinking about him? The wind moved low across the range, lifting dust in thin, wandering spirals that never stayed long enough to be understood. Margaret Callahan stood with her rifle resting against her shoulder, not firing, not moving, just watching. Night was coming on slowly, the kind that didn't rush but crept, folding shadows into every crease of the land. This was the hour she trusted most. When people were tired, when confidence dulled, when truth surfaced. She had trained shooters for decades, but no one had trained her the way Daniel had. He'd never raised his voice, never rushed a correction. He'd believed patience was the rarest skill a sniper could learn. Anyone could pull a trigger. Anyone could chase adrenaline. Waiting, really waiting, that was discipline. That was control. That was survival. "For you," she'd whispered earlier, and the words still lingered in the air like an echo that refused to fade. She hadn't told anyone the scope on her rifle had belonged to him. No one had asked. Most people didn't notice details unless they were loud or decorated. That had always been fine with her. She preferred being underestimated. It gave her room to breathe, room to think, room to act when it mattered. The sound of boots on gravel behind her wasn't a surprise. Reeves never bothered with theatrics. "Operation briefing in the morning," he said. "Big one." She nodded without turning. "They always are." He hesitated, then handed her the envelope. She knew what it was before she opened it. Some instincts never dulled. The photograph inside stopped time anyway. Daniel, younger than she remembered him, kneeling beside a wrecked vehicle in a place that smelled like dust and gun oil and endings. His eyes were sharp, alive, frozen that way forever. She didn't cry, she hadn't in years. Grief had settled into something quieter, heavier, something that lived in her joints and her silence. "He believed in you," Reeves said gently, "more than anyone." "I know," she replied. Her voice didn't shake, that was the problem. Belief doesn't stop bullets. Reeves didn't argue. He never did when she spoke like that. Some truths weren't meant to be softened. 3 days later, she sat in a briefing room full of men who didn't know what to do with her. They were polite, mostly curious glances, side conversations that paused when she looked up. She could feel the skepticism before it was spoken. Navy, woman, older, wrong shape for the role they'd already imagined. When Colonel Pierce announced she would command Blue Force operations, the air shifted. Questions followed, respectful ones framed carefully. Why her? Why now? Pierce answered for her. He always did, not because she needed it, but because he understood what she refused to explain about herself. She stayed quiet, took notes, let them underestimate her one more time. That night she wandered the ranges instead of sleeping. It wasn't restlessness. It was habit, the need to check the edges before stepping into something larger. That was when she saw Vasquez. The young Marine lay prone at the 1,000-yard line, struggling to steady a rifle that didn't forgive hesitation. Her breathing was wrong, her shoulders too tight, her hands betraying how badly she wanted to be good enough. Callahan watched for a full minute before speaking. "You're fighting it," she said softly. Vasquez startled, then flushed. "Yes, ma'am." "Stop it." The word wasn't sharp, it was grounding. Vasquez adjusted, tried again, missed. Callahan knelt beside her, ignoring the ache in her knees. "You're trying to control the rifle. You can't. You have to work with it." They fired again and again. The hits weren't perfect, but they were real. Progress always was. "People like you don't get much grace," Callahan said after the last shot. "You'll have to earn every inch." Vasquez nodded. She already knew that. What surprised her was hearing it spoken without cruelty. Later, when she walked back through the facility corridors, Callahan felt the first stirrings of something she hadn't expected. Responsibility. Not command, not authority, something quieter, the weight of being seen by someone who needed it. She didn't realize how much that mattered until the morning Morrison filed his complaint. Pierce handled it the way he handled most things, with facts, footage, documentation, calm. Morrison's version collapsed under its own noise. Still, the damage lingered. Whispers, doubt, the familiar ache of being questioned not for what she'd done but for who she was. She didn't confront it. She never had. Confrontation required energy she preferred to conserve. Instead, she prepared. When Operation Ghost Wind began, it didn't announce itself with drama. It unfolded, methodical, precise. For hours everything worked. Systems held, teams moved, confidence grew. Then the screens lied. Callahan saw it before anyone else did. The way the data drifted just enough to feel wrong. The way patterns broke rhythm. "This isn't malfunction," she said. "It's deception." Spoofing, jamming, layered interference. Elegant, aggressive, familiar. Keen. Her fingers moved faster than the technicians. She knew how he thought because she'd taught him how to think. Blind the eyes, deafen the ears, force panic. She didn't panic. She reached for her kit. "Where are you going?" Pierce demanded. "To fix it," she replied. He hesitated. Authority weighed against instinct. He chose to trust hers. In the field, Morrison was unraveling. Without GPS, without comms, stripped of the systems he relied on, his certainty evaporated. He could feel eyes on him that he couldn't see. The desert felt suddenly alive, hostile. When her voice came through the static, it didn't sound triumphant. It sounded tired, focused, real. He followed her because he had no other choice. And because, deep down, he knew something he'd refused to admit before. She was everything he was. Callahan moved through the terrain with the economy of someone who had learned not to waste effort. Each step measured, each pause intentional. She found the first emitter by listening, not with ears but with experience. She didn't hesitate. The shot disabled the equipment cleanly, efficient, no flourish. She was already moving before the operators understood what had happened. One down, more to go. She felt every year of her age then, in her joints, in her breath, in the burn that settled into her spine. But pain had long ago lost its authority over her decisions. Purpose hadn't. By the time the second emitter fell, blue force displays began to clear. By the third, panic shifted direction. Reeves watched the pattern emerge on the screen and smiled despite himself. "She's not reacting," he said. "She's dismantling." Pierce didn't answer. He was watching something he'd never seen before, not brilliance, not courage. Control. When Morrison reached cover and realized the threat had vanished, shame settled heavier than fear ever had. He'd been saved by the very person he'd tried to destroy. And she hadn't even looked at him. As night crept back across the desert, Callahan paused on a ridge, resting the rifle against her shoulder. Her breathing slowed. The stars came out one by one. She thought of Daniel again, of patience, of waiting, of the space between heartbeats. And she moved forward, knowing the hardest part of the fight wasn't behind her yet. Sometimes redemption doesn't arrive with forgiveness. Sometimes it begins with survival. What does a hunter feel when the tables finally turn? The night swallowed sound first, then distance, then certainty. Commander Margaret Callahan lay prone on the ridgeline, her body pressed into cold stone, breath measured, heartbeat slow enough to count between seconds. Below her, the canyon stretched wide and deceptive, shadows layered over shadows, every rock capable of becoming cover, every silence a lie. This was the part no one ever saw. Not the medals, not the briefings, not the clean lines on after-action slides. This was where truth lived, alone, unobserved, unforgiving. Her knees throbbed. Her lower back burned with a familiar, dull ache that never quite went away anymore. She acknowledged it the way she acknowledged fear, noticed, then set aside. Pain was information, not authority. She adjusted her position by centimeters, aligning bone with bone, rifle settling into the notch of her shoulder like it belonged there. The scope remained unused. She trusted her eyes more, trusted memory, trusted instinct built the long way through years that had taken more than they'd given back. Below, Red Force moved carefully now, too carefully. Keene had realized what was happening. That pleased her more than she expected. She remembered him young, brilliant and reckless, hungry for speed, eager to prove something even he didn't fully understand. He'd been easy to mold because he'd wanted direction, wanted approval, wanted to be great. She'd given him tools, discipline, restraint, the understanding that patience wasn't weakness, it was dominance refined. She hadn't expected to face him like this one day. The first Red Force element advanced along the canyon floor, 4 operators spread just wide enough to feel safe. They weren't careless. They were professionals. They scanned ridges, checked angles, watched for patterns. They didn't look up. Callahan exhaled slowly and squeezed. The blank round cracked sharp and clean. The lead operator's vest flashed red. He dropped instantly, surprised more than anything else. His partner spun searching for a threat that no longer occupied the space it had fired from. She was already moving. Years ago, she had learned the difference between shooting and surviving. Anyone could hit a target. Surviving meant understanding what happened after the shot. Confusion, panic, overcorrection. She let them feel it. The second shot came from a new angle, then the third, each one separated by distance and displacement. By the time Red Force understood the pattern, there was no pattern left to read. 3 operators down, 1 remaining, frozen, unsure whether to run or hide. She didn't rush him. She waited. When he bolted, she ended it. 4 minutes, 4 lives simulated, 0 exposure. Callahan paused only long enough to check the wind again. Far across the desert, in a shallow ravine surrounded by rock formations shaped like broken teeth, Staff Sergeant Derek Morrison crouched with his team, listening to nothing but his own breathing. The radio was silent again. The woman's voice, Phoenix, had vanished as suddenly as it had appeared. "We should keep moving," Ortiz whispered. "Where?" Webb snapped back. "Blind, remember." Morrison said nothing. His jaw was tight. His thoughts were louder than any gunfire. He replayed the dining hall over and over, the way she hadn't reacted, the way she hadn't needed to. He'd mistaken silence for weakness, stillness for submission. Now he understood how wrong that had been. Another distant crack echoed across the desert, then another. The sound was different than before, controlled, precise, spaced. Someone was dismantling Red Force piece by piece. And it wasn't him. For the first time in his career, Morrison felt something dangerously close to humility. Not embarrassment, not fear. Perspective. He had trained his whole life to be the man with answers, the one others followed, the one who pushed forward when things got hard. Now he realized how shallow that version of leadership had been. Leadership wasn't noise, it wasn't aggression. It was clarity under pressure. And he didn't have it. Back on the ridge, Callahan reached the third emitter just before dawn. The device hummed quietly, hidden beneath camouflage netting that blended perfectly with the surrounding rock. Good placement, clever angles. Keene had learned well. She circled wide, taking the long way, trusting patience over speed. She fired once. The antenna array sparked, sensors registering the kill. Another system down. Her breathing grew heavier now. Age wasn't an enemy, but it was a reality. Every mile cost more than it used to. She leaned against a boulder for a moment, letting the tremor pass from her legs. This was the part she didn't teach easily. The truth that longevity came with a price. That mastery didn't make you invincible. It just made you honest about your limits. She drank from her canteen, just enough. Too much would slow her down. Then she moved again. At Blue Force Command, screens lit back up in clusters. GPS stabilized in sections. Comms flickered. Pierce stared at the display, disbelief slowly replacing frustration. "She's doing this alone," he murmured. Reeves didn't smile this time. "She always has." By midday, Red Force had lost cohesion. Their advantage evaporated. Operators hesitated. Orders conflicted. Confidence fractured. And Keene knew exactly why. He stood inside his canyon command post, arms crossed, listening to reports that made no sense unless one accepted the impossible. One shooter, moving faster than teams, outthinking systems, breaking doctrine. Only one person could do that. He keyed the emergency frequency before she did. "Maggie," he said, voice steady despite everything, "I wondered how long you'd wait." She smiled faintly, unseen. "Longer than you expected." "You're still better at patience," he admitted. "You always rushed," she replied, "even now." Silence stretched between them. Old student, old teacher, equals finally in the only place that mattered. "You could have ended this sooner," Keene said. "Yes." "Why didn't you?" Because this isn't about winning, she answered. It's about learning for both of us. He exhaled slowly. He understood that too. When she took the final shot, it wasn't aimed at him. It was aimed at the last illusion he had left. The antenna fell, systems died, the canyon went quiet. Keene raised his hands. Sierra to all Red Force elements, he said evenly, stand down. When Callahan finally lowered her rifle, the relief surprised her. Not because the fight was over, but because she was tired in a way that had nothing to do with her body. She walked 3 hours across broken ground. Pain became constant, then background, then irrelevant. Each step was a choice, each breath a reminder that she was still here. When she reached the command center, the crowd parted without being told to. Respect didn't announce itself either. Pierce looked at her like he was seeing her for the first time. You went dark, he said. Yes. You abandoned your post. Yes. You saved the exercise. Also yes. He stared at her, then shook his head slowly. I don't know what to do with you. Callahan met his gaze. You don't need to do anything, just don't get in the way. For a moment the room was silent. Then Pierce laughed, quiet, incredulous. God help us all, he muttered. Later that night, alone again, Callahan sat on the edge of her bunk, boots still on, rifle leaning against the wall. She felt older than she had that morning. And stronger. Not because she had proven anything, but because she had endured without becoming bitter. She thought of Vasquez, of Morrison, of all the people who mistook strength for volume. Tomorrow would bring consequences, questions, scrutiny. She welcomed it, because she no longer needed to explain who she was. She had shown them, and sometimes that is enough. What does it cost to stay standing when the ground finally stops shaking? Morning came without ceremony. No trumpet, no victory call, just pale light creeping through canvas seams and concrete cracks, illuminating the quiet aftermath of a battle that hadn't looked like one. Commander Margaret Callahan sat on the edge of her bunk, boots unlaced now, hands resting on her knees. The adrenaline had faded. This was the reckoning phase. The body always demanded its due once the mind released control. Her joints ached with interest. She breathed through it, slow, measured like she always had. Outside, the base was waking, vehicles idled, voices returned. Routine resumed with an almost insulting ease. The world didn't pause just because something important had happened. It never did. She stood, testing her weight, and felt the sharp reminder in her lower back. A warning, not a command. She dressed anyway, uniform crisp, movements economical. Appearances mattered in places like this, not for ego but for order. By the time she reached the command building, the whispers had already started. Not loud, never loud. Respect and resentment traveled in the same tone. Some called her brilliant, others reckless. A few said dangerous. She learned long ago that labels said more about the speaker than the subject. Inside the briefing room, Morrison sat alone. Not isolated by order, isolated by gravity. He looked smaller without his usual posture, shoulders curved inward, elbows braced on his knees like he was holding himself together. When he saw her, he stood too quickly, then froze, unsure which protocol applied. "Commander," he said. She nodded, nothing more. He swallowed. "I owe you." "No," she said, gentle but firm, "you don't." The word unsettled him more than any reprimand would have. Debts could be paid. Guilt could be processed. Being released without condition, that was harder. She moved past him without another glance, not out of cruelty, out of clarity. Inside, Pierce waited with Reeves and 2 civilian analysts. The screens behind them were frozen on maps that told the story better than any speech could. Pierce didn't waste time. "You went off mission." "Yes." "You violated command protocols." "Yes." You compromised the chain of command. Yes. Each answer was calm, unapologetic, honest. Pierce leaned back, exhaled slowly. Do you understand why this is a problem? I understand why it's uncomfortable, she replied. That's not the same thing. Reeves hid a smile. The analysts exchanged looks. One cleared his throat. Ma'am, with respect, your actions resulted in a 97% blue force survival rate. That's unprecedented. Callahan met his eyes. Luck doesn't scale, preparation does. Silence followed, not hostile, thoughtful. Pierce studied her for a long moment. He wasn't angry. He was recalibrating. Leaders like him hated that part, being forced to adjust long-held assumptions. Finally, he nodded once. Debrief at 1800, full transparency. She inclined her head. Of course. When she left, Morrison was still outside. This time she stopped. He didn't speak immediately. His eyes were red, but not from exhaustion, from something harder. I didn't freeze, he said quietly. Not like they say. I know, she replied. That startled him. I still failed, he said. Yes. Another pause, then almost reluctantly, what do I do with that? Callahan considered him, not as a subordinate, as a man at a crossroads. You sit with it, she said. You don't explain it away, you don't weaponize it, you let it teach you. He nodded slowly, and if it does, then you weren't listening. She walked away before he could respond. That afternoon, she found Vasquez on the range again. The young Marine was firing alone, jaw set, frustration radiating off her in waves. Her grouping was tight, but her breathing was off. The same mistake, different day. You're pushing, Callahan observed. Vasquez lowered the rifle, embarrassed. I wanted to do better. Why? Vasquez hesitated, then honest, because you noticed. Callahan felt that land heavier than any shot. I notice effort, she said. Results follow. They worked in silence for a while. Corrections came without judgment, progress without praise. That was how trust grew, quietly. As the sun dipped, Vasquez finally hit center mass consistently. Her grin was unrestrained, earned. Thank you, she said. For what? For not giving up on me. Callahan watched the horizon. I didn't give up on myself. You happened to be nearby. That night, the debrief room was full. Command staff, observers, analysts, Morrison's team. Vasquez stood in the back, silent, watching. Callahan spoke plainly. No embellishment, no excuses. She detailed her decisions, her calculations, her risks. She admitted where luck had favored her, where it hadn't. She spoke of patience, of systems failing, of the danger of overconfidence, of how silence could be used not as absence but as presence. When she finished, no one rushed to speak. Finally, Pierce stood. This exercise will change doctrine. The words rippled through the room. Not because of the outcome, he continued, but because of the method. He looked at Morrison, and because of the lessons. Morrison stood straighter this time, not defensive, open. Later, as the room emptied, Reeves lingered. You okay? He asked. She considered the question, the real one beneath it. Yes, she said finally, I think I am. He nodded. Daniel would have liked today. She didn't reply immediately. When she did, her voice was softer. I liked today too. Outside, night settled again, calm, honest. Callahan stood alone beneath the stars, rifle slung but unused. She wasn't hunting now. She was listening to the quiet, to her breath, to the years behind her and the unknown ahead. Strength, she had learned, wasn't about dominating space. It was about remaining steady when the space shifted. And tonight she was still standing. What happens after the silence finally listens back? The base felt different the morning after the debrief. Not louder, not quieter, just aware. as if something unspoken had settled into the walls and corridors, changing how people moved through them. Commander Margaret Callahan noticed it immediately. She always did. People didn't stare anymore. They measured. Respect, she knew, didn't arrive with applause. It arrived with caution, with consideration, with the understanding that something powerful existed nearby and it didn't need permission to be so. She poured herself a cup of coffee in the mess hall and stood instead of sitting. Old habit. Chairs invited conversations she wasn't ready to have. She watched steam rise from the cup, the simple physics of heat escaping into cooler air. Temporary. Everything was. Across the room, Morrison entered with his team. Their laughter was subdued now, not forced, thoughtful. When he noticed her, he hesitated, then nodded once. No bravado, no tension. Just acknowledgement. She returned it. That was enough. Later that morning, Pierce summoned her again. This time there were no analysts, no observers, just two chairs and a decision hanging between them. "You're being offered an advisory role," he said. "Strategic development, training doctrine. You be shaping how this force thinks for the next 20 years. She absorbed that without reaction. Offers like that came wrapped in praise and expectation. She learned to separate opportunity from obligation. "And the field?" she asked. Pierce exhaled, limited. There it was. She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the range where dust lifted and settled with no concern for rank or legacy. "I'm not done," she said quietly. "I know," Pierce replied. "That's why this is hard." She turned back to him. "If I step away now, I become a story people tell incorrectly." He studied her, then nodded. "You'll get 6 months, field discretion." She considered, then extended her hand. He shook it. "Don't make me regret this," he said. She gave a small, almost smile. "You won't." That afternoon she walked the perimeter alone. Pain flared in her hip with each step now, sharper than before. She adjusted her gait instinctively. Adaptation was survival. Denial was waste. She stopped at the memorial stone near the old range. Daniel's name was there. Others too, friends, students, ghosts she carried without complaint. She rested her hand against the cool surface. "You were right," she said softly. "It never gets easier, but it does get clearer." She stayed there longer than she planned. When she returned, Reeves was waiting. "Word spreading," he said. "People are listening." "Good," she replied. "They should." That evening, Vasquez knocked on her door. "I was told to report," the young Marine said, standing straight, nervous but determined. "Come in," Callahan said. They sat, silent, stretched. Vasquez fidgeted. "I don't know if I'm cut out for this," Vasquez finally admitted. "Some days I feel invisible, other days exposed." Callahan nodded. "Both are accurate." Vasquez frowned. "That's not comforting." "It's honest." She leaned forward. "The world will try to define you before you're ready. If you let it, you'll spend your life trying to keep up with someone else's idea of you." "What should I do instead?" "Build quietly," Callahan said. "Let your work speak when you're tired of explaining." Vasquez absorbed that, then smiled faintly. "That's what you did." "Yes," Callahan said, "and it was lonely." Vasquez straightened. "Then you're not alone anymore." Something shifted in Callahan's chest at that. Unexpected. Welcome. The next operation came sooner than expected. Not an exercise, not a simulation. Real terrain, real stakes. Limited footprint, quiet insertion. Callahan volunteered before she could overthink it. In the helicopter, vibration rattled her bones. She closed her eyes, letting muscle memory settle her nerves. Across from her, Vasquez checked her gear with shaking hands. "You okay?" Callahan asked. Vasquez nodded, scared. "Good," Callahan replied. "Fear sharpens attention." The landing was rough, dust everywhere, chaos controlled only by trust. They moved fast, low, purposeful. Callahan felt the limits of her body now more clearly than ever. Every climb took longer. Every crouch burned. She compensated with angles, with anticipation, with experience paid for in blood and years. They reached Overwatch as night fell. Targets moved below. Patterns emerged. Callahan guided Vasquez's breathing through the scope. "Wait," she whispered. "Now." The shot was clean. Vasquez exhaled, stunned, then focused again. They worked together like that, teacher and student, not bound by rank but by necessity. When extraction came, both were still standing. Back at base, Vasquez couldn't stop smiling. "You trusted me," she said. "Yes." "With your life." "Yes." Vasquez nodded slowly. "I won't waste that." Callahan believed her. Later, alone again, Callahan removed her gear with care. The pain returned in waves now, deeper, persistent. She sat on the edge of the bunk, breathing through it. This was the truth she rarely voiced. Strength wasn't infinite. She stared at her hands, scarred, steady, human. For the first time, she allowed herself to wonder, not if she would stop, but when. And whether that ending could mean something other than disappearance. Outside, the base settled into night. Somewhere, laughter echoed. Somewhere else, someone trained alone, chasing quiet excellence. Callahan lay back slowly, eyes open. She hadn't redeemed herself. She hadn't proven anything. She had simply continued. And sometimes, that was the bravest act of all. What remains when the rifle finally goes quiet? The morning arrived without urgency, as if the world itself was giving her time to decide who she would be next. Commander Margaret Callahan woke before the alarm, as she always had, but this time she stayed still. She listened to the base breathe. Engines warming, doors opening, boots meeting concrete, life continuing without asking her permission. Her body reminded her first. A deep, settled ache ran through her hip and spine, no longer sharp, just present, permanent. She rolled onto her side slowly, respecting the limits she could no longer ignore. Acceptance didn't come easily to people like her. It never had. But denial had started costing more than it saved. She sat up and let the feeling pass. Today wasn't an operation day. No insertion, no overwatch, no targets waiting in silence. And yet something heavier sat in her chest. The sense that a chapter was closing, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the quiet finality of a door shutting behind you without a click. She dressed anyway, uniform pressed, boots laced. Appearances still mattered, not for others but for herself. Ritual was a form of respect. When she stepped outside, Vasquez was already on the range. The young Marine was running drills alone, movements precise, breath controlled, eyes sharp. No audience, no praise, just work. Callahan watched from a distance, leaning lightly against the railing, feeling something warm and unfamiliar rise beneath the fatigue. Continuation. Vasquez noticed her and jogged over. "Ma'am," she said, then hesitated. "I mean, Commander." Callahan waved it off. "You were doing fine." Vasquez smiled, then grew serious. "I heard the rumors." "So have I." "Are they true?" Callahan studied her for a moment. Not the rank, not the uniform, the person, the potential. "I haven't decided," she said honestly. Vasquez nodded, disappointment flickering before discipline smoothed it away. "Whatever you choose, thank you." "For what?" "For showing me that strength doesn't have to announce itself." Callahan felt the weight of that settle deeper than any commendation ever had. Later, Pierce called her in one last time. No paperwork on the table, no witnesses, just 2 cups of coffee and the unspoken understanding that this wasn't a negotiation. "You've given this place something it didn't know it needed," he said. "But the cost." "I know," she replied. "You could stay," he continued. "Teach, advise, shape minds instead of risking your body." She looked at her hands again. The scars, the steadiness, the truth written into skin and bone. "And if I leave entirely?" she asked. Pierce met her gaze. "Then you leave with respect." She considered the years behind her, the nights on cold ground, the faces she'd lost, the silence she'd learned to live inside. "I won't disappear," she said. "I just won't lead from the front anymore." Pierce nodded slowly. "That may be harder for some to accept." "It's harder for me," she admitted. They stood, shook hands, no ceremony. When she walked out, the decision followed her like a shadow finally letting go. That evening, Morrison found her near the perimeter fence. "I heard you're stepping back," he said. "Yes." He shifted, uncomfortable. "I wanted to say you were right about sitting with failure." She nodded. "It's unpleasant." "But necessary," he added. "Yes." He hesitated, then spoke again. "I won't forget what you showed us." She believed him, not because of his words, but because of the quiet humility behind them. Night fell gently. Callahan returned to the range one last time. No observers, no students, just her and the rifle that had shaped her life. She lay prone, more slowly now, settling into position with care. The stars watched silently. She lined up the shot. Then she lowered the rifle. Some endings didn't require a final trigger pull. She lay there anyway, feeling the earth beneath her, remembering the first time she'd learned to wait, remembering Daniel's voice, remembering the woman she'd been and the one she had become. When she stood, the rifle went back into its case, not retired, not abandoned, just resting. The next morning she left before dawn. No send-off, no speeches. Vasquez watched from the barracks window, heart tight but steady. Reeves saluted from a distance. Pierce didn't come at all, he understood. Callahan drove until the base disappeared behind her. For the first time in decades, there was no mission waiting, no coordinates, no threat to anticipate. Just road. She didn't feel lost. She felt light. Weeks later, a training manual circulated through the ranks. No author listed, no dedication page, just clear language, patience, observation, restraint, responsibility, quiet strength. Doctrine changed. People changed. And somewhere far from the noise, Margaret Callahan stood on a ridge at sunrise, hands resting on the railing, breathing in a world that no longer needed her to prove anything. She hadn't been the loudest. She hadn't been the youngest. She hadn't been the most celebrated. But she had endured. She had taught. She had acted when dignity demanded action, and stayed silent when silence carried more weight. And in the end, that was enough. Because sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts.